Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to Games as Lit 101. We find ourselves once again in the spooky month, which means I am contractually obligated to talk about one of my favorite games of all time. Poor me. I've already done a couple videos related to Fatal Frame because while it was once considered one of the kings of interactive horror, it's largely faded from cultural consciousness, since the fourth game never got localized and the fifth was only available to the 6 people who owned a Wii U. At least until the port to all major platforms, which should be out by the time this video goes up. I genuinely love the Fatal Frame trilogy, and I think it deserves all the attention it once had and more. So I want to talk about it, starting with the first one and continuing through the series each October from here on out. So then, what is Fatal Frame? Fatal Frame was released in December 2001 for the PlayStation 2 and localized for North America a few months later with the requisite terrible American box art. It also got an Xbox port nearly a year after its initial release. The original Japanese title is actually Project Zero, which makes this probably the only example of renaming a franchise in English and actually coming up with a better title. Seriously, what genius took the zombie game about science experiments gone wrong and thought it would be better to call it Resident Evil than Biohazard? Anyway, the game takes place in a haunted mansion deep in the forests of Japan. The player explores the mansion, uncovering its tragic and brutal past while defending themselves from malicious spirits. The game's unique twist is its combat. The player fights these ghosts with a camera, bringing the perspective from the fixed third-person camera angles into a first-person view. It's an ingenious and uniquely terrifying gameplay format that really set it apart from other games in the genre, and while a number of games have been clearly inspired by it, this format has rarely been meaningfully replicated since. As usual, we're going to talk about the story in full detail, so if you want to experience this classic horror game for yourself, I highly recommend you do so before watching the rest of this video. If you can, at least, it's really only available in its original PS2 and Xbox versions. The Xbox version should be backwards compatible on modern Xbox systems, and the PS2 version is actually purchasable digitally, but only on the PS3, so since there haven't been any ports or remasters for modern systems, it's not all that easy to get a hold of, so, if you can, I recommend it. Also, just a quick content warning, this story centers around a bunch of really gruesome ritual murders. The game shies away from showing the most violent parts, but they are nonetheless a big part of the story and described in pretty great detail. And in addition, there is some description and imagery of suicide by hanging, so take care of yourself, watch at your own discretion. So then, let's grab our cameras and uncover the secrets hidden throughout Fatal Frame. Fatal Frame centers on the current and historical events surrounding the ancient and abandoned Himuro Mansion. The player takes the role of Miku, a young woman who comes to the mansion in search of her brother, Mafuyu. Mafuyu had come to the mansion in search of respected folklorist Junsei Takamine, who had come to the mansion weeks before, hoping to find answers behind the disappearance of his colleague Ryozo Munakata, who was himself in the mansion to find answers about the Himuro family. And it's becoming clear that I can't summarize this in the way that I usually do. The true Fatal Frame is the current events of the game, which are just a framing device. Okay, sorry, but no, really, the events of the game are just a matter of communicating the backstory, and that backstory is told through a combination of journals, clippings, and subtle inferences. This kind of storytelling is kind of surprising to see here, actually. It wasn't really popularized until BioShock 6 years later, and even BioShock was more explicit about it and had more overt storytelling in its present story. The real thing it reminds me of is From Software's work, which didn't really start gaining popularity until a full 8 years later. It works really well, especially considering how unestablished the format was at the time of Fatal Frame's release. But it also makes the story exceedingly difficult to summarize in my usual manner. I generally try to at least retain the structure of the stories I talk about in these videos, but in this case I think I'm going to have to summarize the events of the game chronologically rather than in the order that you find out about them in the game itself, if this is going to make any sense. So, here we go, from the beginning. Himuro Mansion is an ancient mansion dating back to before the Edo period. It was home to the Himuro family, who had a very important mission, keeping a Hell Gate sealed through a series of gruesome, recurring rituals. There were 3 rituals, all central to Fatal Frame's story and repeated every 10 years in the history of the game. First is the blinding ritual, in which a young woman is forced to wear the blinding mask, which is exactly what it sounds like. A mask with 2 spikes where the eye holes would be, so when worn, the woman is blinded. Soon afterward, the second ritual begins, the demon tag ritual. The recently blinded woman plays the role of the titular demon in a game of hide and seek, and the girls of the mansion, who are over 7 years, 9 months, and 25 days old, hide from her. The first to be found is chosen as the next blinded maiden 10 years from then, and the last to be found takes on the most important role, the rope shrine maiden. She is to be ritually sacrificed in the third and most important of the rituals, the strangling ritual. After being chosen through the game of Demon Tag, the Rope Shrine Maiden is kept in isolation for 3,669 days, so she develops no earthly attachments during that time. After that decade of isolation, she is taken down to the Hell Gate in a cave beneath Himuro Mansion, where she's placed on a circular altar and tied at her wrists, ankles, and neck. 5 priests, led by the Himuro family master, slowly tighten the ropes until the Rope Shrine Maiden's arms, feet, and head are all ripped from her body. The 5 ropes used to do this, now soaked in the maiden's lifeblood, are used to seal the Hell Gate, and they're good to keep it sealed for another 10 years. Like I said, it's some super messed up stuff, which is, of course, why it eventually went horribly, apocalyptically wrong. When a young woman named Kirie was chosen to be the Rope Shrine Maiden, her time in isolation was complicated by the arrival of a young man, a visitor to the mansion. They met unexpectedly, and she was enamored by him and his descriptions of the outside world. The priests realized she was gaining a will to live through her attachment to this young man and a growing desire to see the world, so the Himuro family master had the young man killed. They hid this fact from Kirie, but she wasn't fooled. So when her strangling ritual was performed in the year 1837, her attachment to the world and grief from the loss of her lover caused the ritual to fail. The Hell Gate opened, unleashing the Malice. This catastrophe instantly killed most of the mansion's inhabitants and trapped their souls in this world. The Himuro family master, perhaps out of madness or perhaps out of a misguided attempt to spare the survivors from further torment, wandered the mansion with a katana and beheaded any survivors he found. Kirie's spirit, meanwhile, was split into 2, a child representing her purity and innocence, and a vengeful spirit of her young adult self infected with the Malice. The latter wandered the halls of Himuro Mansion, seeking to inflict the same pain she suffered on any who dared enter its cursed halls. So of course, over a century later, a family entered its cursed halls. Ryozo Munakata moved into Himuro Mansion with his wife, Yae, and their daughter, Mikoto. Ryozo and Yae are actually relevant to the events of the second game as well, which does take place before the events of this one, but that is still well outside of the purview of this video, so we're just going to focus on their role in this story for now. Ryozo was a folklorist who bought the mansion's ruins hoping to uncover its secrets, but shockingly, that turned out to be a terrible idea. Mikoto one day found a camera, claiming it was given to her by a young girl in a white kimono, the ghost of young Kirie. One day, when Yae took a photo of her daughter with the camera, young Kirie's ghost showed up in the photo. After this, Yae became obsessed with the camera, taking pictures all over the mansion until she didn't even need it to see the ghosts anymore. But one day, Mikoto had some friends over to play Demon Tag. Not the actual ritual, basically just hide and seek, but they called it Demon Tag. And the hiding children were never found. It's later revealed that they were taken by a ghost, a man whose grief over his daughter's sacrifice in the strangling ritual compelled his ghost to take other children as replacements. Overcome with grief and blaming herself, Yae hung herself on the cherry tree in the back of the mansion. Ryozo, his family all missing or dead, threw himself into figuring out the mansion's supernatural secrets and stopping this from ever happening again. But unfortunately, he only got so far as the entrance to the underground cave before he was taken by Kirie and killed. Mikoto, however, survived the fateful game of Demon Tag. She was led to safety in the forest by the ghost of young Kirie. But since both her parents were now dead, she was raised by a family friend after this, and took the camera with her, passing it on to her daughter, Miyuki. Miyuki is our protagonist's mother. She, too, used the camera until she could no longer handle what she saw and hung herself much in the same way as Yae, leaving her children, Mafuyu and Miku, alone. Later on, Ryuzu's colleague, a folklorist named Junsei Takamine, went to Himuro Mansion with 2 assistants in hopes of discovering what happened to Ryuzu. This trip went badly. One of his assistants began seeing the malicious spirit of Kirie, and each time, rope marks would appear on his body, first on his wrists, then on his ankles, then around his neck, until finally he was found with his limbs and head strangled off. Takamine's second assistant was more clued into the supernatural happenings of the mansion, but ultimately met the same fate. Takamine, having seen Kirie and found rope marks on his own body by this point, decided, much like Ryuzu before him, that his only chance was to figure out what happened here and try to fix it. But in his attempt to find and reunite the 5 pieces of the Holy Mirror, an important relic to the rituals that was shattered when the Malice was released, he was caught by Kirie before he could complete that goal. Soon afterward, his protege Mafuyu went looking for him. This is where the game begins, with the player taking the role of Mafuyu for the prologue. It turns out the camera, found in this very mansion and passed down to Mafuyu through generations of his family, can not only see ghosts, but capture their spirit energy as well. It's the only weapon the player wields throughout the game. Mafuyu, however, quickly encounters Kirie, and the game switches to its main protagonist, Miku, who is now at the mansion in search of her brother. This whole story is basically just a string of people in sequence coming to the mansion to figure out what happened to someone else who came to the mansion to figure out what happened to someone else who came to the mansion to figure out what happened to someone else who came to the mansion to figure out what happened to someone. Miku journeys through Himuro Mansion, slowly uncovering all the history we just went over and encountering the ghosts of many of the story's major figures. Nearly all the ghosts in the game fit into this backstory one way or another. The man who took the children themselves, the victims of the blinding ritual, children who played demon tag, the severed heads of the Himuro family master's victims, Mr. Takamine and his assistants. With very few exceptions, the player will come to understand the backstory and role of all the ghosts they encounter in the game. It's surprisingly thorough. Miku's goal eventually becomes clear. Find all 5 pieces of the shattered Holy Mirror and confront Kirie at the Hellgate. As the game progresses, though, Miku is accosted by Kirie, and each time she wakes up the next night with new rope marks, first on her wrists, then on her ankles, but Miku eventually finds 4 of the 5 pieces of the Holy Mirror before descending to the Hellmouth and reuniting with Mafuyu. Turns out, Mafuyu bears a striking resemblance to Kirie's murdered lover, and she led him safely down here to take him for herself. Miku tries to fight Kirie, but her spirit and the malice that's infected it are too powerful for the camera to contain, and it shatters. But this reveals the final piece of the Holy Mirror. It was used as a mirror in the camera, presumably explaining its purifying powers. Miku places the 5 pieces of the mirror in the altar, and when Kirie is reflected in it, she is purified, and the malice banished back to behind the Hellgate. Finally returned to her true self, Kirie takes it upon herself to keep the Hellgate sealed, guarding it at great pain to herself for the rest of eternity. Mafuyu makes the decision to stay with her, so his spirit might grant her some peace and companionship during her eternity of suffering, and Miku escapes as the spirits trapped in the mansion are finally allowed to move on. It's worth noting that this isn't the only ending, but it is the canonical one. Playing the game a second time on a harder difficulty grants an ending where Mafuyu escapes with Miku, but expresses sadness at Kirie's eternal suffering. The Xbox port adds some images in the credits of that ending, showing that Kirie and her lover are reunited in the afterlife. But those aren't how the story truly ends. Instead, Mafuyu sacrifices his life in hopes of easing Kirie's pain, and Miku alone escapes the mansion. So that's Fatal Frame, and we do have plenty to talk about. But before diving into what the story means, we've got a few other things worth addressing. The game's cover and marketing make a big deal about how the game is based on a true story, and it seems worth addressing that before we go into exactly what it all means, because this statement is a big stretch. The first clue is that this claim is only present in the marketing of the game outside of Japan. I think they knew that the only people who had much of a chance of actually believing this are people who don't already have much established knowledge of the actual history and folklore of Japan. I and many others have tried looking into any actual historical or even just legendary or mythical presence of a Himuro mansion and Himuro family and Aside from a few articles detailing folklore, but really just regurgitating the actual details of this game, it just doesn't seem to be a thing at all. There is an actual Himuro shrine in Japan, but it bears little resemblance to the game's mansion and has no legends resembling Fatal Frame's story. There are some pictures going around of locations from the game, but while they do have a striking resemblance, they're taken from known locations that are definitely not a haunted mansion in the middle of the woods. It's more likely the locations in the game were designed based on these scattered real-life places. I haven't even found any proof of urban legends resembling the game's events or setting that are any older than the game itself, indicating it's unlikely that any of the game's details are rooted in anything more than the creator's imaginations. But that's not to say there's no real-world inspiration behind Fatal Frame. The game's director, Makoto Shibata, claims to have experienced a number of supernatural events over the course of his life that informed this game, including seeing a procession of spirits outside of his childhood home, and even some strange events that happened during the production of the game itself. He's said in interviews that the game is designed to simulate a sense of knowing, that feeling that something is there even if you can't see it. This is expressed through tricks in the sound design, subtle vibrations in the controller, and mechanics centered around taking pictures of hidden ghosts that can only be found with these audio and tactile clues. Shibata wanted to create this game as a way of sharing his own experiences with the supernatural, and what it feels like to be certain of something you can't see or explain. There's a website that's translated a variety of interviews that include more details about this. There's a link in the description if that's something you're interested in looking into further. But it's safe to say that these alleged supernatural experiences of the game's director are the closest we're gonna get to the true story this game is supposedly based on. So, with that out of the way, it's time to talk about what Fatal Frame is saying as a story. One of the recurring concepts in Fatal Frame is folklore. Folklore is a shared body of culture and stories passed down throughout a certain group, and as a result, it's uniquely expressive of the fears, values, and history of that group. And crucially, folklore is passed down through stories, songs, and other forms of direct communication. That is to say, it's not something that you can just, learn in a history class. Folklore is embedded in the culture itself. Folklore is a central subject of interest to Fatal Frame, as its story includes multiple folklorists who intend to discover the mansion's secrets. But this idea of significant stories that inform our lives and cultures is all throughout the game. Everyone in the story is here because of some kind of historical significance to their own lives. The Himuro family keeping the Hellgate closed, the Munakata family's research into the mansion's history, Mr. Takamine uncovering the truth behind his colleague's disappearance, Mafuyu trying to discover the fate of Mr. Takamine, and finally, Miku just trying to find her brother. But this element of the story becomes even more pervasive once we discover just how interconnected all of these events and characters are. The legacy of this place is passed down in the form of the curse and then the camera, all the way from the Munakata family to their descendants Mafuyu and Miku. All of these people have ties to what happened here, whether they know it or not. Nothing in the game seems to imply that there's any real force of destiny at work here. It's not like these characters are magically bound to this place and fated to return or anything so fairy tale-like as that. But that's the thing, they don't have to be. Like ropes tied around their limbs, this place has left its mark on each of them, on their families and friends, and eventually all of these characters make the choice to follow the thread that leads them back here. This idea of folklore as a shared heritage that reverberates through the lives of everyone connected to it is a surprisingly succinct and powerful microcosm of how these traditions and stories retain their significance to people through generations. Whether that's a good or bad thing in this case, though, that's something Fatal Frame presents as being a little more complicated. It was, after all, the gruesome traditions passed down through the Himuro family that started this whole mess. Then the echoes of that heritage haunt others. Even Miku's mother, whose only connection to these events is the camera. She's never actually been to the mansion, but she couldn't escape the traumatic legacy it left in her family. And throughout the game, characters suffer out of a sense of obligation, when much of this tragedy could have been averted had they simply not. Mafuyu certainly would have met a better end had he not pursued his mentor. and Takamine himself would have spared the lives of himself and his 2 assistants had he left well enough alone instead of feeling the need to find out what happened to his friend. And the Munakatas would have done well to cut their losses and get out well before all the children disappeared, which started the downward spiral to both Yae and Ryozo's deaths. With the passing of Himuro Mansion's heritage comes a duty that all these characters eventually fall to, even if they really didn't have to. But despite this, it's the process of uncovering the mansion's history and understanding its significance, even in the face of its horrible truths, that leads to the ultimate resolution. This is why the game is structured as it is, with relatively minor and arbitrary narrative movement in the present scenario of the game used as a framing device to uncover the history of the mansion. It's all about how this shared past informs our ability to act in the present. And as with many of the best video games, this theme is not only present throughout the story, but baked into the process of play itself. The uniqueness of Fatal Frame's gameplay isn't just in how unique or interesting or well-constructed its systems are, but the role it plays in making the game as famously scary as it is. It could have simply gotten by on its oppressive atmosphere, creepy sound design, horrifying story, and disturbing ghosts, but it took things a step further by designing the gameplay itself around the same principles of horror that guide the rest of the game. The format of fixed camera angles has largely fallen out of style, and I understand why on some level. It was a solution to a technical problem that no longer exists, and it necessitates some clever movement design to avoid some awkward elements, like the tank controls of the original Resident Evil games, or the limited visibility while sneaking around in Metal Gear Solid. But it also means the game has opportunities for scares when perspectives shift, unsettling angles when entering a new area, and altogether creepy visual presentation in its cinematography. For games like this, it just works. I mean, look at these camera angles. It's just a gorgeous game. But it also allows for the game to play with perspective in interesting ways, namely because the player never has any direct control over how they view the world around them, and that in itself adds an element of fear. You never know what you'll see next, and if there's a threat nearby, you can't just swivel the camera to look at it. But it also means the camera usually has some degree of distance from the horrifying things on screen. The ghost is over there, and as long as it doesn't get close to Miku, who is also over there, you'll be just fine. Except the game doesn't let the player stay comfortably far away. It makes them get close. Because while the game is generally presented in these third-person angles, the only way to fight the ghosts is to look through the camera's viewfinder and move down to a first-person perspective. The game makes the player put themselves right in front of what they're seeing, makes them look at it closely and directly. What's more, they'll do far more damage if they let the camera focus on the ghost for long enough to build up power, and even more damage if they wait until it's literally about to strike to snap the photo. The game makes you sit and wait and stare before it lets you make your move. It's all just a brilliant premise for a horror game, to consistently make the player leave the relative comfort of these detached camera angles and put themselves on the ground right in front of the thing that's scaring them. And if that weren't enough, to then make them watch and wait and keep their cool in the face of these horrors until just the right moment. It's easy for a combat-heavy horror game to normalize its monsters and mechanics enough that by the end there's just not much fear left in the process of play. It's why so many Resident Evil games turn into action fests by the end. They drop all pretense, and instead of waiting until the action is no longer scary, they just lean into it and let the bullets fly. That dwindling fear through repetition is certainly present in Fatal Frame, but it's heavily mitigated by the format itself. If seeing each of these new things, these mangled and maimed ghosts, is scary in and of itself, this process of getting on their level and forcing oneself to patiently stare them down elevates the horror significantly. I honestly think it's some of the most brilliant horror gameplay out there, injecting even the basic mechanics with the same horror the whole game is otherwise drenched in. But it's not just great because it's scary. It also reflects the game's themes of discovering folklore and heritage. Just as in the story, Miku cannot just ignore these threats and run away. She has to stare it down, study it, understand it, and take action. The very process of play reflects both the horror of these ancient secrets and the process by which they must be discovered, studied, and resolved. There's a reason your only weapon in the game is a camera. This isn't about combat and violence, but about recording hidden truths, uncovering secret histories, and exposing myth to find the reality underneath. Myth becomes recorded history, and they live on in the pictures we take rather than haunting this unknown place. The process of building up camera power, as well as the mechanic of the zero shot, is a mechanical metaphor for the careful study and research it takes to truly understand folklore. And since this is a horror game, that process is terrifying. It requires keeping calm until the very last second, withholding judgment and action until you're absolutely sure of what needs to be done. This process of capturing truth requires time, care, and certainty before you can use it to protect yourself. Even when the camera breaks at the end, unable to fully handle the power of this ultimate truth, it reveals the final piece necessary to actually resolve things. The consequences of the events we've discovered have reverberated through time, continuing to affect people and cause suffering to those caught up in its legacy, allowed to fester and grow simply by virtue of not being known. We've been gathering the truth inside this camera the whole time, and now, having uncovered everything, it grants us the solution. The camera is central not only to the process of play, but the meaning of that play as well. It's how we defend ourselves, as well as how we come to understand the stories that led us here. But once these stories are understood and the picture comes fully into clarity, what happens then? How do these themes of folklore and heritage and duty manifest in the ending of the story? Well, it's complicated. I feel like we often overlook the role tragedy plays in a lot of horror stories. Not just that bad things happen because it's scary, but the way so many horror stories are, in narrative structure and theme, constructed like tragedies. When done well, this works nicely and contributes to the horror. The inability to return home in movies like The Thing or Annihilation, for instance, or the depiction of a couple whose unstable relationship creates a death spiral in Paranormal Activity. But on the other hand, it can often be shoved into stories where it doesn't really belong, such as the gotcha ending in Nightmare on Elm Street that pops up out of nowhere despite the story having already come to a satisfying conclusion. It effectively cancels out whatever understanding and meaning the story had built up to that point. Whatever the fate of our protagonists, a good story will, usually, build up to it, using the conclusion as a thesis that naturally follows from the story up to that point. All that to say, I have some complicated feelings about Fatal Frame's ending. Throughout most of the game, it would be difficult to argue that Fatal Frame views the rituals of the Himuro family as anything but evil. It goes to great lengths to depict their brutality, not by reveling in the violence itself, but showing the horrifying aftermaths, focusing on the suffering. The game doesn't make a gory show out of blinding a girl with a spiked mask, for instance, but it does do a hell of a job selling the suffering it causes her. The children taken from the Munakatas were killed due to the grief of a man whose daughter was taken from him for the strangling ritual, and the whole story centers on how it all went wrong simply because a young girl felt a will to live. The strangling ritual relies on manipulating and exploiting the innocence of young girls that don't know any better, and then brutally, painfully murdering them to perpetuate the cycle. And if all that wasn't obvious enough, the head of the Himuro family, the man who oversees the rituals and beheaded the survivors after the calamity, wears the mask of reflection, which changes to reflect the soul of the person wearing it, and on him, it's the face of a demon. It's not exactly subtle about all this being profoundly traumatic and morally inexcusable. And yet, it's all justified. In the end, Fatal Frame maintains that these horrific rituals are a necessary step to protect the world from demonic forces. Kirie can't escape the burden of the Rope Shrine Maiden, and there's no alternative to keeping the Hell Gate sealed. Everything the Himuro family did, all those gruesome and torturous rituals, are ultimately affirmed. As a horror story, I understand why this choice was made. After all, the only thing scarier than being attacked by the spectral victims of a bunch of ancient ritual murders is the idea that those murders were actually a good, necessary thing. That the only reason you're safely sitting in front of your computer watching this video right now is because someone, somewhere, in a dark cave that you'll never even know exists, was brutally murdered to afford you the luxury. But, as is sometimes the case with tragedy and ambiguity in these kinds of horror stories, it also makes it kind of hard for the game to take much of a stance on the things that it was showing us. I mean, what are we supposed to do with a story that spends hours throwing disturbing images and evil actions at us and then says, that was good, actually? It kind of just makes everything else up to that point feel irrelevant. So, why does the game do this? Well, the cynical answer is that the writers simply weren't trying very hard to provide a satisfying ending, and that is possible. Lord knows plenty of video games have fallen into that trap, but I think it's more likely that they were simply more focused on a scary ending than a thematically coherent and satisfying one. But even so, there are still some significant ideas to pull out of it. One of Mifuyu's notes claims that the spirit of young Kirie regrets having been unable to fulfill her duty as the Rope Shrine Maiden, and Kirie's actions at the end of the game back that up.
Don't forget your duty.
And you know what? Even if these rituals were all totally necessary, that's sad. That Kirie could look back on a lifetime of physical and psychological abuse, even her gruesome death, and still think, I want to fulfill this duty? I find that deeply tragic. And there's some level on which the game seems to frame this final act as her moment of self-actualization. Where suffering had regularly been forced onto innocent young girls, herself included, she now takes on this mantle as a choice, sparing anyone else from ever needing to suffer the same fate. That's the difference between the strangling ritual and what Kirie does at the end of the game. The rituals required new victims every 10 years, while Kirie's choice to block the Hellgate herself is a permanent solution. Albeit a permanent solution that requires her spirit to block the gate herself in excruciating pain and loneliness for all eternity. This idea of an informed choice to suffer for others rather than a coerced obligation follows to Mifuyu as well, as he decides to stay and ease her pain. In this way, Fatal Frame seems to be suggesting that the purpose of folklore, of understanding and learning from our shared heritage, is in solving the problems history presents us with, rather than stubbornly sticking to the traditions that helped to cause and perpetuate them. Freedom is found in knowing our past and charting a new path, rather than forcing the suffering and the mistakes of our past onto others. But while I find this reading compelling, it's also kind of a stretch still. I mean, regardless of Kirie's tragic dedication to the cause, the only thing standing between Earth and a demonic apocalypse is making sure that Hellgate closes and stays closed. So, given the circumstances, it's hard to really argue that Kirie had much of a choice in the matter. And it could be similarly argued that Mifuyu's decision to stay was somewhat coerced given the circumstances. So while there is some meaning to be found here, ultimately I do still think Fatal Frame dropped the ball in the end by counteracting its horrific portrayal of these rituals with the revelation that they were legitimately for the greater good. The greater good. And believe it or not, this isn't even the worst example of that in the series, but we're gonna have to wait to talk about that until next year. It kind of feels like, in the end, Fatal Frame is about a lot of things, but doesn't have much to actually say about them. It incorporates all these ideas about history and folklore, about familial duty and abuse, about innocence and choice versus coercion, but it ends up feeling kind of muddled in the end on pretty much all of it. Well, not all of it, though. The stuff about folklore and staring down the past is still really strong, and a lot of that is because this is just a brilliantly designed game, and that's why I still think of it, regardless of any flaws or disappointments, as a masterpiece of its genre. It's just so rare to see such a unique idea not only executed so well, but blended so perfectly into the overarching themes of the game. Fatal Frame takes an inventive gameplay concept and weaves it into the fabric of the game on every level, resulting in a thoroughly horrifying and seamless combination of visual ideas and gameplay mechanics combined into a cohesive whole. Fatal Frame is an impressive feat of interactive horror storytelling, even if the story being told doesn't quite live up to its potential. Thanks so much for watching, and while you're here, if you enjoyed the video, I'm only a few hundred short on Patreon of making this my full-time job. So any likes, comments, subscribes, shares, pledges on Patreon, any of that takes me a little closer to making that dream a reality. So if you enjoyed this video and the channel, please do consider it. Until next time, class dismissed.